The FBI recovered hundreds of audio reels from the jungle settlement at Jonestown, sermons, meetings, music, ordinary tape, recorded over and over by a group that documented almost everything it did. And one of those reels was still turning during the final hours, catching a public address microphone and the voices around it. That tape exists. It has been released. You can request it. And the strange part isn't what people imagine is on it. It's what's missing, what the recording cuts away from, and why the number the world memorized was wrong for years. By the end of this, you'll understand something most people who think they know this story have never been told. That the version repeated for decades, the cult that drank the Kool-Aid, is wrong in its details and wrong in its shape. That the U.S. Congress investigated it and published a report. That the FBI's own file on the case runs into the tens of thousands of pages. And that the last tape, the one everybody references and almost nobody has actually listened to, does not support the picture in your head. It records something harder to look at. So let's start with the story you already know. Here's the popular version. A charismatic American preacher named Jim Jones built a following in California, moved it to the jungle of Guyana, and in November 1978, persuaded more than 900 people to voluntarily drink poisoned Kool-Aid in a mass suicide. A congressman went to investigate, was murdered at the airstrip, and the community killed itself rather than face the consequences. It became a punchline. Drinking the Kool-Aid still means blind, willing belief. That's the story that survived, and it's not invented. The deaths happened, the congressman was killed, but every part of that summary compresses something the record refuses to compress. Start with the paperwork, because there's a lot of it. In May 1979, the House Committee on Foreign Affairs published its report on the assassination of Congressman Leo Ryan and the events in Guyana. Ryan, a Democrat from California, had flown to Guyana with journalists and relatives of Temple members after years of complaints reaching Washington. Concerned relatives had been writing letters. Former members had given affidavits. This wasn't a surprise settlement in the jungle that nobody had heard of. It was a place U.S. officials had already visited, already asked questions about, and already written cables home about. So why did nothing stop before the airstrip? The name matters here. Jonestown was formerly the People's Temple Agricultural Project, a few hundred cleared acres in Guyana's northwest district, reachable by air to Port Kaituma and then a rough road. Remote by design. The People's Temple began as a church in Indiana, moved to California, and by the mid-1970s had real political standing in San Francisco. It ran services, it ran programs, it delivered volunteers and turnout. That's the part people skip. This was not a fringe outfit hiding in the woods from the start. It had letters of commendation. It had access. And then, quite deliberately, it moved almost everyone out of the country. Now the tapes. When the FBI took over the site investigation, agents recovered a large quantity of audio reels, and those recordings became part of the Bureau's file, the Rye Moore file, named for the Ryan murder. The temple recorded constantly. Meetings, sermons, telephone calls, radio traffic with the San Francisco headquarters. Over the following decades, those tapes were cataloged and, through public records requests, released. Researchers at San Diego State University's Jonestown Institute have transcribed and indexed a great many of them, which means this is not a sealed secret. It's a public archive almost nobody reads. and one tape in that catalog changed how historians describe the ending. It's usually referred to by its FBI tape number, and it's commonly called the death tape. It's roughly 45 minutes of audio captured in the central pavilion as the deaths were beginning. A microphone was live. Jones speaks at length. Others speak too. And what it records is not a congregation in unison. It records argument. A woman on that tape openly resists, asks about the children, asks whether there's another way, and is talked down and shouted down by voices in the crowd. That exchange is documented, transcribed, and available, so the question changes shape. How voluntary was any of it? The physical evidence pushes the same direction. The Guyanese pathologist who examined bodies at the site and the American investigators who followed documented injection sites on some of the dead. Guyanese and U.S. authorities also recorded that a large number of the dead were children, and children cannot consent to anything. The poison itself has been misremembered too. Survivor accounts and site inventories describe a powdered fruit drink, and the brand most often named in the record is Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid, though containers of both were reportedly present. That's a small correction. It matters because it shows how loosely the famous version was assembled. There were armed guards. Multiple former members testified before and after that the settlement had firearms, that people had rehearsed loyalty tests, and that leaving was not simple. Passports and documents were held centrally. The nearest road out led to the same airstrip where Ryan and 4 others had just been shot. So picture the geography. Jungle on every side, one route, and men with guns on it. The word suicide, applied to 900 people in that situation, does a lot of quiet work. Some researchers and Jonestown scholars argue murder is the more accurate word for most of the deaths. Others resist a single label entirely. Then there's the number, and this is where the record gets genuinely uncomfortable. The first figures released to the world were far lower than the final count. Early reports spoke of a few hundred dead. Days later, the total climbed past 900. The official accounting settled at more than 900 people, and the reason for the gap has been debated ever since. The most commonly cited explanation is grim and mundane. Bodies lay over one another in the heat, and the initial count from the air and from the ground undercounted the dead beneath, including many children. Other accounts have suggested confusion between military and civilian counting teams, and the record does not fully settle which explanation dominates. What is settled is that the world was told one number and then told a much larger one, and that the correction was never absorbed by popular memory the way the Kool-Aid line was. Congressman Ryan's murder is documented in the House report. The names of those killed with him at Port Kaituma are recorded, and survivors did exist. Some people walked into the jungle, some were away from the settlement. Their testimony is on the record too, and it complicates everything. So what really happened, as far as the documents allow us to say? A leader in serious physical and psychological decline, by multiple accounts, in a settlement he had built to be unreachable, faced an outside investigation that had already left with defectors on board. When Ryan's party was attacked at the airstrip, the settlement had no way back. What followed in the pavilion, on the evidence of the tape, the autopsies, and the survivor accounts, was a coerced mass death, carried out with poison, administered to children first, argued about openly by at least one adult, and enforced by armed men on the only road out. That's not a subtle distinction. Calling it mass suicide places the moral weight on 900 ordinary people, most of them poor, many of them black, a third of them children. Calling it what the evidence supports places the weight on the man holding the microphone and the men holding the rifles. The difference is the whole story. Which raises the question this channel exists for. If the report was published in 1979, if the tapes were released, if the transcripts are online, why did the wrong version win so completely? Partly because the punchline arrived first. Kool-Aid entered American slang within months, and a joke is easier to carry than a congressional report. Partly because the story was foreign, remote, and hard to film. Reporters could not simply drive there. And partly because the victims were people American institutions had already failed. Relatives had complained for years. Former members had signed affidavits. Officials had visited and filed cables. Nobody had stopped it. A story about a cult that killed itself asks nothing of anyone. A story about warnings that went unanswered asks quite a lot. And there's the archive problem. The FBI's file is enormous. The tapes are not a single dramatic document. They're hundreds of hours of ordinary life, sermons and admin and singing, and the labor of listening fell mostly to a small number of academics and relatives. Interest revives when something visual surfaces. A photograph, a new print, a reel nobody had cataloged. Every time that happens, the same discovery gets made again, because the corrected story never replaced the joke in the culture. It just sits there in the record, waiting. So here's the revelation, and it's not a hidden document. It's the opposite. Nothing about the ending was concealed. The tape recording the final hours was recovered, cataloged, released, and transcribed. The autopsy findings were reported. The congressional report was printed and sold. Every piece needed to correct the record has been publicly available for more than 40 years. The burial was not done by censors. It was done by a slogan. The most effective cover in this story wasn't classification. It was a phrase catchy enough that nobody felt the need to check. What's still unsettled is real, and I won't pretend otherwise. How many of the more than 900 took the poison willingly, how many were injected, and how many were forced, cannot be determined person by person from the evidence that exists. The exact sequence inside the pavilion is reconstructed from one live microphone and the memories of people who ran. The precise cause of the early undercount is still debated, and the internal decision-making of the temple's leadership in its final days is argued over by historians who have read the same tapes and reached different conclusions. The record does not settle these things. More than 900 people died in a place built so that nobody could easily reach them, and the world remembers them through a joke about a drink brand that was probably the wrong brand. That's the actual burial. Not a locked vault, just a phrase repeated until it replaced the evidence sitting in a public archive. If you want the harder version, the report and the transcripts are there under the Ryan investigation, and they're worth the afternoon. Next time, another recording nobody was meant to hear, this one from a cockpit that was still transmitting after the crew had stopped answering. Subscribe if you'd rather have the file than the slogan,